In 1960, an archaeologist working in the frozen wastelands of Greenland made a discovery that would challenge everything we thought we knew about Viking history. Dr. Henrik Larsen was part of a Danish expedition investigating medieval Norse settlements when his team stumbled upon something extraordinary buried beneath centuries of ice and permafrost. What they found wasn't just another Viking grave. It was the tomb of a woman whose very existence had been erased from history. The skull that emerged from the ice belonged to a woman, but the golden circlet around her head and the weapons scattered around her body told a very different story than what archaeologists expected to find. This wasn't the grave of a typical Viking woman. The artifacts surrounding her spoke of power, of leadership, of a status that no historical record had ever acknowledged. When DNA testing became available decades later, the results were shocking. This woman was directly related to Eric the Red himself, the legendary explorer who first colonized Greenland. But here's what made the discovery truly extraordinary. There was no mention of this powerful woman in any surviving historical document, saga, or chronicle. It was as if someone had deliberately erased her from history. Her name was Freydis Eriksdottir, and she was Eric the Red's daughter. But unlike her famous brother, Leif Erikson, who was celebrated as the first European to reach North America, Freydis had been systematically written out of the historical narrative. The question that haunted researchers was simple yet profound. Why would the Vikings, who were meticulous record keepers of their heroes and leaders, completely erase one of their most powerful figures from memory? To understand Freydis and her fate, we must first understand the world she was born into. Greenland in the early 11th century was a harsh frontier, a land of ice and stone where survival itself was an act of defiance against nature. Eric the Red had established the first Norse settlements there around 985 AD, after being exiled from Iceland for murder. This wasn't a land for the weak or the timid. It was a place where only the strongest, smartest, and most ruthless could hope to survive. Freydis grew up in this unforgiving environment, but unlike other Viking daughters who were expected to master domestic skills and marriage politics, she learned the arts of war and leadership from her father. Eric the Red saw something special in his daughter, a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and charisma that reminded him of himself in his younger days. While her brothers learned to navigate and explore, Freydis learned to fight, to lead, and to make the hard decisions that kept their people alive in one of the world's most hostile environments. The first hint of Freydis's true nature appears in the fragmented records that do mention her, though these accounts were clearly sanitized to minimize her role. According to the Greenland saga, she participated in an expedition to Vinland, what we now know as North America, around 1004 AD, but the saga's account of this expedition is suspiciously brief and contradictory, suggesting that much of the original story was deliberately suppressed. What we can piece together from archaeological evidence and careful analysis of the surviving texts tells a very different story. Freydis didn't just participate in the Vinland expedition, she led it. The expedition wasn't just about exploration or trade, it was about establishing a permanent Norse presence in the New World, with Freydis as its ruler. The archaeological evidence from Lansor Meadows in Newfoundland supports this theory. The layout of the settlement, the distribution of artifacts, and the evidence of long-term habitation all point to a more sophisticated and ambitious colonization effort than previously believed. Most telling are the remains of what appears to have been a great hall, not just a temporary shelter, but the kind of structure that would serve as the seat of power for a ruler. But Freydis's ambitions extended far beyond establishing a colony in Vietnam. Evidence suggests that she was planning something unprecedented in Viking history, the creation of a maritime empire that would span from Greenland to North America, with herself as its empress. This wasn't just about exploration or even conquest. It was about fundamentally reshaping the political structure of the Norse world. The traditional Viking society was patriarchal, with power passing from father to son through established bloodlines. But Freydis represented something new and potentially revolutionary, a woman who had earned power through her own abilities rather than inheriting it through marriage or birth. Her very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions about gender and power that held Viking society together. This is where the story takes a dark turn. According to the suppressed accounts that have survived in fragmentary form, Freydis's rise to power didn't go unchallenged. Her brothers, particularly Thorvald and Thorstein, viewed her growing influence as a threat to the traditional order. More troubling for them was the loyalty she commanded among the settlers and warriors who served under her. The conflict came to a head during the winter of 1006 AD. Fretis had returned to Greenland to gather supplies and reinforcements for her expanding operations in Vinland, but she found a conspiracy waiting for her. A plot orchestrated by her own family members who had decided that her revolutionary ideas about female leadership were too dangerous to allow. The confrontation took place during what should have been a celebration, the midwinter feast that marked the darkest point of the Arctic year, according to the surviving fragments of an account written by a monk who interviewed survivors decades later. The evening began normally, with the traditional toasts and recounting of heroic deeds. But as the night progressed and the ale flowed more freely, old tensions began to surface. Fretis had been arguing for a more aggressive expansion into Vinland, proposing to establish multiple settlements that would eventually become self-sufficient colonies. Her vision was breathtaking in its scope. She saw the possibility of creating a new world empire that would dwarf anything the Vikings had achieved in Europe. But her family saw only the threat to their own power and status. The attack came without warning. As Fretis rose to speak about her plans for the coming year, her brother Thorvald suddenly stood and accused her of betraying Viking traditions by claiming authority that belonged only to men. The accusation was clearly real, and it was quickly taken up by other family members who had been recruited to the conspiracy. But Fretis was not easily intimidated. According to the account, she responded with a speech that laid out her vision for the future. A future where leadership would be based on ability rather than gender, where the Norse people could build something greater than they had ever imagined. Her words were so powerful that many of the assembled warriors began to show signs of support for her position. It was then that the conspiracy revealed its true nature. This wasn't just about family politics or traditional gender roles. It was about preventing a revolution that could have changed the course of history. The established power structure of Viking society, from jarls to kings, had too much to lose if Fretis succeeded in proving that women could be effective rulers. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Viking history. This wasn't a raid against enemies or a territorial dispute between neighboring clans. This was a civil war within one of the most powerful families in the Norse world, and its outcome would determine the future of Viking civilization. Fretis fought with the fury of someone who knew that defeat meant not just death, but the complete destruction of everything she had worked to build. The surviving accounts describe her as fighting like a berserker, her red hair streaming behind her as she cut down opponents with a skill that impressed even her enemies. But she was vastly outnumbered, and the conspiracy had been carefully planned. The battle raged through the night, with Fretis and her loyal supporters making a fighting retreat to the shoreline where their ships were anchored. The plan was to escape to Vinland, where she could rally her supporters and return with a larger force. But the conspirators had anticipated this move and had already sabotaged most of the ships. As dawn broke over the blood-stained snow, Fretis found herself trapped with only a handful of loyal followers, facing an enemy force that included her own brothers. It was then that she made the decision that would define her legacy. Rather than surrender and accept defeat, she chose to fight to the death, taking as many of her enemies with her as possible. The final confrontation took place on a rocky promontory overlooking the sea. Fretis, wounded and exhausted, made her last stand with her back to the ocean and her face to her enemies. The accounts describe her final moments as almost mythical in their intensity, a warrior queen refusing to yield even in the face of certain death. But the story doesn't end with Fretis's death. In fact, that's where the real mystery begins. Because according to the archaeological evidence, Fretis didn't die in that final battle. The tomb discovered in 1960 shows no signs of battle wounds, and the careful burial with full honors suggests that she died peacefully, possibly years later. This contradiction has puzzled historians for decades. How could Fretis have survived the battle that supposedly ended her rebellion? And if she survived, what happened to her in the years that followed? The answer appears to lie in a remarkable deception that was maintained for centuries. The evidence suggests that Fretis did escape from Greenland, probably with the help of loyal followers who staged her death to allow her to flee. She made it to Vinland, where she lived for several more years as the ruler of the Norse colonies there. But her exile was not a defeat. It was a strategic retreat that allowed her to build something unprecedented in Viking history. Under her leadership, the Vinland settlements grew and prospered, developing new techniques for surviving in the American wilderness and establishing trade, relationships with indigenous peoples that would have far-reaching consequences. The archaeological evidence from North American sites supports this theory. Several locations along the eastern coast of Canada show evidence of sustained Norse habitation that extends well beyond the traditionally accepted dates for Viking exploration. More intriguingly, some of these sites show evidence of cultural fusion between Norse and indigenous traditions, suggesting a level of cooperation and integration that was rare in Viking history. This cultural blending may have been Freydis's greatest achievement. Unlike other Viking leaders who relied on conquest and domination, she seems to have understood that successful colonization in the New World would require adaptation and cooperation. The evidence suggests that she established peaceful relationships with local tribes, learned their languages and customs, and created a hybrid society that combined the best elements of both cultures. But even in exile, Freydis remained a threat to the established order back in Greenland and Iceland. Her very existence was proof that the traditional power structures could be challenged, and her success in building a new society in Vinland demonstrated that alternative forms of leadership were not only possible but potentially superior. This is why her story was systematically erased from the historical record. It wasn't enough to defeat her militarily. Her ideas and her example had to be completely eliminated from memory. The Viking Skald, who were responsible for preserving and transmitting the culture, stories, and traditions, were pressured or bribed to omit any mention of Freydis from their accounts. The process of historical erasure was remarkably thorough. Not only were Freydis's achievements deleted from the official sagas, but any mention of her revolutionary ideas about leadership and society were systematically removed. The few references that survived were carefully edited to portray her as a minor figure, who played only a supporting role in her male relatives' adventures. But historical truth has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts at suppression. The physical evidence, the tomb, the artifacts, the archaeological sites, tells a story that no amount of historical manipulation can completely erase. And as modern scholars have developed better techniques for analyzing and interpreting this evidence, the true scope of Freydis's achievements has begun to emerge. The implications of her story extend far beyond Viking history. Freydis Eriksdottir represents one of history's great what-if moments, a point where the course of human development could have taken a dramatically different path. If her vision of female leadership and cultural cooperation had been allowed to flourish, the European colonization of the Americas might have proceeded along very different lines. Instead of the conquest and exploitation that characterized later European expansion, we might have seen a model of cooperation and mutual respect between indigenous and European peoples. The hybrid society that Freydis created in Vinland could have served as a template for a very different kind of new world, one based on equality and cooperation rather than domination and extraction. The tragedy is not just that Freydis was defeated, but that her defeat was so complete that her very existence was nearly erased from memory. For nearly 1,000 years, her story was lost, known only to a few scholars who had access to the fragmentary accounts that survived the historical purge. But now, as we piece together the evidence and reconstruct her remarkable life, we can finally give Freydis Eriksdottir her proper place in history. She was not just Erik the Red's daughter or Leif Erikson's sister. She was a leader, a visionary, and a revolutionary who dared to imagine a different kind of world. The golden circlet found in her tomb was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a crown, the symbol of a queen who ruled not through inheritance or marriage, but through her own strength, intelligence, and vision. And though her kingdom has long since disappeared beneath the ice and snow of time, her legacy lives on in the questions she forces us to ask about power, leadership, and the paths not taken in human history. Freydis Eriksdottir was the lost Viking queen, the ruler of a forgotten realm, the woman whose story was too dangerous to be allowed to survive. But survive it has, waiting beneath the ice for archaeologists to uncover and historians to reconstruct, and in doing so, they have given us back not just a lost chapter of history, but a reminder of the revolutionary potential that lies hidden in the stories we think we know.